Welcome to the webinar, Ukraine Crisis, Your Love at Work in a Time of War. Thank you for joining us today as we report back to you on how your compassionate and generous response has helped and supported the people of Ukraine. We are recording this webinar to share it with those unable to join us at this time. On February 24th, Russian forces attacked the people of Ukraine, forcing 7 million people to become refugees across Europe. Many of those refugees are women and children. In addition, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, estimates that some 7 million people have been displaced internally in Ukraine, and some 13 million people are estimated to be stranded in afflicted areas or simply unable to leave. In addition, Ukraine and Russia are major producers of grain and fertilizer to the world. The ripple effect of the war is impacting the most vulnerable people on the planet. Just in the last 3 months, 23% of children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition in South Sudan. In Sudan, 16% of children under 5 are acutely malnourished. In Yemen, it's 24%. And in Niger, in West Africa, 14% of children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. In the case of Niger, this is an additional 2.5 million children. 2.5 million children in just the last 3 months are acutely malnourished. While the need is great, you have responded. And we are here to thank you. And we are here on behalf of the people living inside Ukraine, as refugees in Europe, and for the millions of people at risk across Africa and around the globe due to this war. Lutheran World Relief's Chief Humanitarian Officer, Tamara DeMoria, has traveled inside Ukraine to help manage your response and has worked with people in Europe to provide welcome, care, and protection for those who are refugees from Ukraine. And along with the global program staff of LWR, she is helping to respond to the millions of people in West Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, and Lebanon who are being pushed to the brink of starvation due to this war. Tamara began working at LWR in 2020 and brings years of experience in leading complex humanitarian and development programs. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Tamara DeMoria. Welcome.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome to this webinar. I would like to start off with the heartfelt thanks and gratitude to every single participant who has found time to listen in and is interested in how we're using your precious support to extend valuable humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, as well as Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine because of the unfortunate situation and the war unfolding in this country. As John said, I do come with a very colorful background, I would say, combining both working in the very sort of hard countries and hotspots around the world throughout my career, as well as managing programs that look beyond the emergency assistance into more sustainable development. And I would probably say that it never amazes me to discover something new and complexity of responding to emergencies every time we're dealing with the humanitarian crisis in particular countries around the world. Ukraine was just a huge drop of uncertainty because we realized it is not a typical underdeveloped country where you would run independently, or at least do a lot of humanitarian program setup without necessarily following the overall architecture of how the emergency response or how the government is cheering and leading some of this. Because in Ukraine, we found that this is a country where you are dealing with a very developed structure, coordination mechanisms from the government side, albeit overwhelmed. A lot of digital transformation is happening. financial systems are still operating, and people have sophisticated needs. And in order to respond to them in a dignified way, we really had to think how to tweak our own approaches, including how to operate in urban contexts. It's not the same when you have villages where you can easily identify those affected and particularly most vulnerable, whether it's war or natural disaster. And when you have high-rise blocks, high-rise buildings full of families that are trying to escape the crisis, the missiles, the attacks from whatever the military interventions look like, it is really hard to follow, to trace, to identify, and reach the most affected and vulnerable. I would be more than delighted to give a summary of how we have used your precious donations to expand our support to Ukraine crisis, not just in Ukraine, but also in Poland, where we have partnered with the Lutheran World Federation and have attended to the needs of millions of refugees fleeing to Poland, which was one of the major recipient countries. It is not the only country in Europe that has sheltered the refugees from Ukraine, and unfortunately this number remains to be pretty high and stable, especially as we get into the winter season. And those of you that see where the geography is for Ukraine, it's pretty high up north, so it gets really chilly and quite cold, and this is one of the biggest concerns for all of the humanitarian implementing partners and organizations, to see these needs through, and especially for those that have lost their shelter. Let's go through some facts and figures, if I can have the slide, because it's easier to look at what the situation looks like today. And these are some of the most recent figures, which are really heartbreaking and disheartening. But on the map, all these yellow bubbles and sort of shaded orange or yellowy area is where most of the military engagement is happening. The fighting, all the ugly stuff in terms of sexual and gender-based violence as a result of war, fleeing, displacement of millions of people. The eastern part of the country is very much affected, and that's where we see a lot of these developments happening even to date. You will also find this little bubble that says 1.9 million. That's a lot of people that are still stranded in those areas, unable to leave their houses, or just afraid to keep on moving, or afraid of ending in parts of the country where they may not necessarily have relatives or people that can shelter them. You will also find these different bubbles spread across the country, which indicates how many people have been displaced. And displacement in this case means that they either have no shelter to go back to and their houses were completely destroyed, or these people have been seeking refuge within their own countries and are becoming an extra burden, I would say, to a certain extent, to their extended families and friends. And some of them live in collective centers such as kindergartens, schools, sports halls. And we still have a lot of these people not necessarily having a strategy or clear future as to where they take their families and their belongings, if they were lucky to bring anything along with them. All the countries around Ukraine, except Belarus, although Belarus included, have sheltered quite a large number of the refugees. And those that have fled from early days of war, that the number has not necessarily been declining. People tried to return, those especially that had language issues, could not integrate within the other European countries, because it is not as easy to operate in European Union. You have different policies, different rules and regulations that you have to abide by. And even these people are now considering to go back to basically survive the winter, because the predictions in Ukraine are not necessarily the brightest. They're talking about power cuts. They're talking about shortage of fuel, and therefore heating will be an issue. And as we all know, when it's really, really cold in those sort of cement buildings, we're looking at severe conditions, and especially in places where these internally displaced have been housed for temporary reasons. Some windows are just not possible to insulate unless you totally replace them. And we've been doing a little bit of that from a project perspective, and I'll touch on that in a second. Couple of other facts that might be interesting to acknowledge. We're looking at 5.7 million children, school-age children, that have been affected since the start of the war, including close to 4 million now. I think 3.6 is a formal figure, but the real numbers are slightly higher, are just not able to attend properly and close the school years. And this is of a huge concern for parents. We're talking about some hybrid models, but imagine a telephone, a cracked phone, a smartphone that is the only source of info, connectivity, and this is the phone that your child needs to use when they have to attend the virtual classrooms. Parents are just in total dismay because they cannot see it through in terms of quality, and children are also very much affected by the mental and psychological issues. One thing that really touched me when I was going through different collective centers where we are supporting the internally displaced was a mother that approached me and said, you cannot believe, but my child can differentiate this, what is fired in terms of the missiles or rockets by the sound of it, because we have sat in the basement for so long, they could actually guess and they would play a game. And basically this would be the way they would entertain themselves for months in the basement. These are some really horrifying stories, in addition to how we are seeing the families moving across the country, let alone those that have sought refuge outside of Ukraine, because as John mentioned in his opening few sentences, these are mostly women-led households. Men are not able to leave the country because they have to fight, or if they have mandatory conscription, and therefore it's a limiting sort of regulation in the law, the decree that was adopted by the government. So most of the times we're seeing families moving under just a female support and female leadership, and very often these are elderly, these are people with special needs. And I've been to multiple places where you see a lot of these people unattended to in terms of their needs, and really in horrifying conditions, and pretty much changed and bedridden, changed to the wheelchairs or bedridden, and not necessarily enjoying any of the humanitarian support, because they're not even identifiable because of the magnitude of this crisis. Can we click on the next slide, please? There are, again, close to 12 million people in need of shelter, in need of humanitarian assistance, in need of food. This is all critical and is a growing concern. And as we were noting, malnutrition will be a longer-term effect. The lack of food security and access to food items is going to be noticeable in the longer run as the markets are depleting its sources and stocks. Ukraine war is not only a problem for Ukraine, it has started creating a lot of problems, not just within the European countries, but also outside of Europe in some of the remote places like West Africa. You would never think that some of those countries depend heavily on the import of wheat, which is produced largely in Russia and Ukraine. And because of the stalled shipments and how this was pretty much impossible to get the thousands of metric tons of wheat from the Ukrainian ports overseas, we're looking at significantly disrupted supply chain and inability of these communities in places like South Sudan, Uganda, Lebanon, Yemen, those places that are already at the brink of starvation and really impacted by what is happening in Ukraine. Coming back to our core humanitarian areas, I think it's worth highlighting that every dollar counted, and we were absolutely blown away by generous support received by all of you and from all of you. And I cannot be thankful enough on behalf of our Ukrainian staff, on behalf of everyone that has received humanitarian and emergency provisions, be it non-food items or any other type of support, including medical, including protection-related support, which includes gender-based violence victims and accompaniment of those cases, because we had hundreds of women arriving from those battlefields having undergone some hell. And I will not even retell the stories, which are absolutely mind-blowing and just inhumane to listen to. When I think of those shelters that I have been visiting and we've been supporting, one lady comes to my mind when she approached me and she said, can you imagine, I was so ashamed of the body odor of having spent 2 months in the basement with no shower and ability to attend to the basic personal hygiene, that I was ashamed to get off the bus, which pretty much brought me to that collective shelter. And other women that I did not even know made a way and basically allowed me to use the shower ahead of them and gave whatever the skirts and blouses they had to combine a set of clothing, because I arrived with nothing at all. These are stories which are really hard to process. We're all human beings. Most of us are mothers, if not all of us, have some affiliation to little children. And when you hear these stories, they're really heartbreaking in terms of how much hardship these families had to go through, and what does that look like in terms of longer term support that they require. We were super lucky to have both in-house technical expertise and capacity to extend and think through the programming and activities that will be matching the evolving needs. Obviously, Lutheran World Relief is not the only organization that operates in Ukraine or in neighboring countries. I think there is no single organization that can attend to these needs. We all realize that we need to join forces to make a difference when we have a humanitarian crisis of such magnitude. And on the slide, you see a couple of services that we are providing across both in Poland as well as in Ukraine. And on the other slide shortly, you will see how they differ from each other in terms of the magnitude of our activities. You have probably heard a lot that there was call for multi-purpose cash assistance. What does that mean? It is very often a jargon that non-governmental organizations use a lot, but it's basically ability to have these people, whether they're refugees or internally displaced, make dignified choices about where they want to spend money, instead of prescribing what is the actual need, and how we external people arriving from overseas or from outside of the country believe they're in need of. So there is a growing need for that flexibility in programming, and allowing the families to invest in health needs, pay for the medicines, pay for education of their children, purchase clothing, which they do not have anymore because they had to flee their respective areas, to attend to the food needs rather than depend on some rations that are potentially distributed by the humanitarian organizations. These are the needs that we've been hearing all across in 2 countries that we were responding to, both in Poland as well as inside Ukraine. Obviously, water, sanitation, and hygiene remains of a high priority. You can imagine what can happen in a collective shelter where you're overusing the bathrooms or showers. And it's just very hard to maintain the basic standards of the sanitation. And we've heard pleas to help them rebuild those collective showers and also distribute some of the disinfecting materials and liquids. And we've been procuring a lot of that and working with the collective shelters to ensure that the prevention and infection control is happening on adequate levels. And we are not just distributing items, but also teaching them and reminding them of the hygiene practices, sanitation practices, and what needs to be done to prevent any kind of communicable diseases that can be spread with the basic human touch and contact. We haven't limited ourselves to the work related either with internally displaced or the refugees, but we went beyond that. And your generous support also helped us discuss some of the critical pivoting points with the government of Ukraine in terms of their social protection system, which was undergoing a massive reform and unfortunately was disrupted because of the war. We all very well know and realize that in countries which experience massive humanitarian crisis, there is continuous disruption to potentially well organized and or well thought through reforms and government-led processes, and Ukraine was not an exception to that. We also realized that there is a lot of sort of parallel tracking of the resources that very often governments are not able to account for, and particularly in situations when there are disbursements of cash to affected population, when there are distributions of different kinds. The government requested to help streamline all of that and streamline so that they have a better handle on the social protection needs, that they have a better handle on the vulnerability and the targeting of who is really in need and who is left out, because it's very easy to over target certain families and not necessarily identify those that may be of a insignificant need. And therefore we have partnered with the government to accompany them with the technical support and ability to mainstream the programming of the social protection system. Next slide, please, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we work with the local organizations as well. We do have Ukrainian partners that are at the forefront of all of this. We are working very closely with the professional trade unions that manage the collective centers, which house hundreds of internally displaced. We are also working very closely with the local organizations that provide mobile health services, because through hundreds of interviews that we have conducted over the last couple of months, one message was very clear, especially in the eastern parts of the country. The disruption in health services was very dire, and access to basic health care, access to basic diagnostics, prescriptions, identification of certain diseases, and management of such was really of a huge concern. So on this slide, you see Poland and Ukraine, and some of the examples of how your support has enabled us to accomplish a lot to date, and we are programming this even further for another year or so. We have, just to give you a couple of figures, we have funded 79,000 days for people to stay for free in those collective centers that have a little bit of comfort and look more like hoteling options before they made up their mind to move on or seek alternative strategies as to what their housing would look like. We have provided hot meals. We continue to do that. This number will be tripling, if not more, over the next couple of months, because those that wanted to leave left, and those that have nowhere to go are still staying and in need of that shelter. We will be attending to the needs of at least 30 health facilities across the country, particularly eastern and central parts of Ukraine, doing rehabilitation for minor damages, restoring the services, identifying the sanitary conditions, and enforcing the standards, looking at the waste management of particularly biohazard materials, because waste management has become a huge problem, particularly for the country, especially after the war. As I noted earlier, gender-based violence was on the rise. You probably were hearing horrifying stories from the war. Children, women, men, young boys, irrespective of gender. There were some horrifying stories that are probably never going to leave me, and it's really hard to digest it. But we're looking and working with the local partners as well as the government and other organizations to identify specific clinical as well as psychological support for these people and accompany them from a broader sort of comprehensive programming and support services as they require more than just medical attention at this stage. In Poland, just to highlight our unique partnership with the Lutheran World Federation. It was a very strategic as well as very practical arrangement, because we wanted to acknowledge the presence of our brothers and sisters, and also acknowledge the ability to join the forces of European Lutherans as well as American Lutherans, and enable this to reach bigger numbers and expand our programming beyond just a single effort in a single geographic location. So for now, we have provided programmatic support and strategic accompaniment to Lutheran World Federation to manage a huge program of 50,000 people receiving the humanitarian cash assistance so that they would be supported over the few months and their families would have ability to attend to the basic needs that they identified in the country that they are not necessarily seeing themselves staying for too long. In addition, we have provided screening of the enrollment centers. You can imagine just showing up in a center where you have to register the whole household in order to be eligible. A lot of things can go wrong. And we were both training our staff as well as Lutheran World Federation staff and other service providers to really detect the cases for a particular human trafficking possibilities or the violence victims or people that required accompaniment, information sharing, and much broader hand holding and sort of assistance than just receipt of humanitarian cash. Especially women arriving from Ukraine into the stations of these European countries in early days. The reports coming out of these monitoring missions across the humanitarian community were really horrifying as to how they're trafficked into sex work, into some other types of violence and unnecessarily labor that is beyond their consent. We were very concerned that this could turn into a massive uncontrollable situation, but luckily I think what we managed is to be part of the bigger conversations together with other organizations and extend both technical knowledge and know-how as well as accompaniment of individual families and they knew where to come, how to raise their concerns, where to get more information and how to be accompanied throughout the emergency support. So it's not just a vague sort of statement of humanitarian assistance. I believe from a health perspective, which I already noted, we have seen a lot of shortfalls in terms of not just seeking primary health care, but also attention to some of the chronic diseases, and particularly those that suffered diabetes and cancer, as well as some other communicable and non-communicable diseases. And the ask was very clear. They wanted to have the mobility of those services reaching the rural areas. And when you see the bullet point on essential health services, especially on Ukraine side, which you see is heftier as compared to Poland, because Poland is still European Union and a lot of European Union structures were capable of absorbing the caseload of these refugees, whereas in Ukraine, the gaps were pretty vast. So on the essential healthcare part, what we did, we launched the mobile health teams. And imagine it's a big van full of specialized local doctors with no language limitations, capacitated to identify, accompany, prescribe and redirect to proper referral systems any of the medical cases that they come across. As well as we launched a mobile medical unit, which is what I call clinic on the wheels, with more sophisticated lab diagnostics and capacity to bring those medical services to the doorsteps of people. So we are going to be covering largely pretty much the whole eastern and partially southern part of Ukraine, where the gaps in health service access is really dire as compared to rest of the country. Anyone who was living in Kiev, or majority of the specialists, also fled as the situation started evolving. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine, as you know, and it is part of the eastern geography. So a lot of the shift is what we started seeing in terms of the medical and technical personnel shifting to the western part of the country, where before the health services were not that developed. So this reshuffling that naturally happened in country was also something we had to adjust. I think lastly, I would highlight the fact that we are looking at a significantly more expensive response than in some of the countries that you may have heard on the news before. The cost of living is is much higher. The European standards are definitely influencing Ukraine, and what is the result of the war is the shortage of fuel, which drives the prices of pretty much everything tremendously and impacts the supply chain as well as availability of the basic staple and other types of goods on the market. We have to adjust in order to be able to meet the needs. And this is not just a LWR struggle, but I think it is the concern for all of the humanitarian organizations operating in Ukraine that this has to be regulated, and this war has to end first and foremost, because it has now turned into more of a protracted crisis. And it's 6 months. We're entering a very harsh winter season, which is of a huge concern. We're looking at disruption in even shaky services that existed before because of the winter, because of the temperatures and all of the other sort of factors that impact ability to move freely across the country. The displacement from the impact areas is still happening. It's nonstop, unfortunately. In some of the bigger cities that are still under constant shelling, we're seeing a spike in those numbers, and people are seeking refuge within their own country, and we see the waves of the internally displaced arriving in new locations. So it's almost like a cycle where it is not necessarily that easy to put a point to an end. I think just to highlight a few elements, and I'll stop here for any questions that you submitted and John may have compiled for this webinar. People are super grateful. I think one thing I highlight and always notice in Ukraine, they're absolutely grateful for moral, emotional, as well as financial support that they have received to date. They always ask me to bring this voice back to the donors, because pictures can be pictures, but the human stories are so fascinating and are worth 1,000 pictures at times. And I was really compelled to be their messenger to share how much of the support they felt, how much of the support they appreciate. And they know that with the technical professional support that Lutheran World Relief is delivering to them, they're living the dignified life and also feel safe and protected for the time being. I think we still haven't reached the end point. It is a continuous challenge. Unfortunately, media does not talk about Ukraine as much as it used to be before. And I think that's a very natural spike, and then sort of it goes downhill, unfortunately, and with any other news around the world. But just to assure you, we're doing everything on the ground, reinvesting back in the livelihoods of people to see them through this hard time. I'll stop here, John, for any questions you may have, and we'll be more than happy to answer those.
Thank you, Tamara. Yeah, so as you indicated, we synthesized some of the questions that were submitted. Thank you for those of you that did submit questions. So the first question I'll ask is, with shipping resuming out of the port of Odessa, is there any assessment of the degree of impact that this may be making globally?
I think it is a little hard to assess the global impact for now. We're looking at shifts in global economy in some of the countries that I listed before, because of the high dependency on the wheat as well as sunflower oil production. We're looking at millions of people impacted as a result of the stalled shipment to date already. I think it is too early to say whether the released shipments will make a significant difference, because we're looking at reshuffling and readjustment of some of the behaviors as well as the consumption patterns in these countries, and it is still a longer term effect, which is a little bit hard to account for. In addition, I think it's easy to understand it's not about only the food consumption, but also the security and then unrest, which is very often caused by lack of food commodities in certain countries that are already going through hard times, and particularly those affected by conflict elsewhere. We're monitoring this. Lutheran World Relief is responding to some of these countries that we actively engage with and work in. These are Yemen, Lebanon, Mali, Mali. Some of the other countries that also will be impacted are Niger and Nigeria, where we also have footprint. So it is vital to support these countries and find the intermediate solutions before it deteriorates to a point where it is a global catastrophe, and at the same time work on Ukraine's agricultural season as well as economic sort of reinvestment and rebuilding of the economy is going to be a parallel track process that all of us, not just LWR, but all the other organizations will have to focus on in order to avoid some global outcomes and aftermath as a result of this grain detention in the ports.
Thank you. Another question is, as the conflict looks to be long-term, what do you think? Do you think surrounding countries will continue to be patient and compassionate in housing these refugees? And you touched on some of the educational needs of children, but in anything else you'd like to share about the educational needs being addressed of children, and how can we help?
It's a great question, and I think the patience is really running out, is what we're noticing in some of these countries, particularly those that have housed millions of refugees and continue to house millions of refugees. People have been partially, not everywhere, not in every country, embedded into the social systems. And imagine these countries cannot cope and keep up with their own vulnerable populations. And here comes a wave of additional layer of the most needy population segment that they know have nowhere to go. And I think what we've noticed in Poland in particular, despite the fact that Poland is such a friendly country to Ukraine, that the actual irritation of the local population is growing, because they're seeing this becoming a burden to their families because of social policies that were adopted to be inclusive of the Ukrainian refugees, because of the humanitarian assistance targeting refugees, but not necessarily meeting the same needs of the Polish very vulnerable or mostly marginalized populations. Poverty has not been canceled in these countries. And I think what we're seeing is now the growing frustration of the host populations, even inside Ukraine, because we've heard a couple of stories from the families that were displaced that they can no longer stay with their friends and family. For how many months can they feed them? They're also impacted by the war. Some of them have lost jobs, and it is really impacting their ability to basically provide food on the table. So we're looking at the growing frustration, which will probably become a source of conflict at some point. It's just a matter of time. And I think this is where the pressure on the government and governments, not just Ukrainian government, but pressure on the governments overall, as well as some of the bigger international political arena to help resolve this issue, is very high, and the stakes are very high as well. Inside the country, we're trying to mitigate this by also identifying the needs of the host community. So it's not just targeting the internally displaced, but also takes into consideration some of the needs of the host families, so that the support is spread somewhat comparatively equally to all those affected by the war.
And one last question here. What are the socioeconomic classes in a normal Ukraine or before the war? And are the poor left without means to immigrate?
Very tricky question and not as easy. I think I would start by saying that Ukraine has not been immune to corruption. So unfortunately, the war has not been has not really had any positive impact on corruption either. We are seeing there's probably a very thin middle class, if I can classify it that way. A lot of people that depend on farming and agricultural production, We're looking at people engaged in social sphere. There's a huge, there are huge groups of people that depend on the state paid jobs. The salaries are very low, so obviously it's very hard to sustain the needs of your family. And then there's the upper class, obviously, with not a huge one, but still pretty prominent and quite wealthy. So is there poverty in Ukraine? Absolutely, yes. Has that aggravated the poor and their well-being right now? Absolutely, yes. We're looking at now compounded effects of the war on top of the social disbalance and social inequity that already existed in country. And I think it is going to be even harder for those groups to overcome the needs because they have not necessarily been served any different. And in order to meet their existing needs pre-war, plus compounded effects of the war and lack of options, opportunities, and clarity in how and what the future holds for them is really concerning. Women and girls are in particularly affected because this is a group that has been mobile more than other parts, other segments of the population. We're looking at greater needs of the youth, especially given that Ukraine is quite a young country in terms of its sort of makeup population-wise. The needs of the youth are dire because they've not been able to continue their studies. They haven't been able to earn their living, and now the conscriptions are quite mandatory, and they're talking about even mandating women to go to the front lines because of the lack of manpower to fight this fight. So yes, these groups are uncovering the layers of poverty and social injustice. I think is not as easy because right now a lot of organizations are doing life-saving operations from a humanitarian standpoint. If we're talking about long-term, that will require investment, and we really hope that this will be a strategic policy and advocacy point, not just by only LWR or similar like-minded organizations, but also the constituents when they talk to their congressmen, to their senators, to divert the funding in the right channels and understand the foreign investments a little differently as to how prolonged are the crises and what are those sort of ripple effects of such wars and humanitarian situations on the livelihoods of people. You can't rebuild agriculture overnight. You can probably distribute something so people don't go hungry to sleep, but if you're looking at helping them survive, you're looking at investing in longer term, and this is what we're trying to get across as the message together with our peer organizations, partners locally and internationally, so that the further institutional donor investment is really geared towards targeted programmatic accompaniment.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for your leadership here, not only in Ukraine and also in Poland and Europe, responding to the war, but globally in humanitarian assistance. Thank you so much. We would like to take this opportunity to show a thank you video to all of you that will personalize what you have done and the people whom you've impacted here through your generosity.
Але те, що розпочалося з цього лютого, дуже відрізняється від того, що було 8 років тому. Яке було у нас на до і після розділилося до 24 лютого.
З 24 лютого під ранок ми з дітками прокинулись від того, що почались вибухи дуже сильні вибухи були, навіть раніше, ніж в 4 ранку почалися вибухи, були скрізь вибухи, було зірвано у нас міст.
24 числа я проснулась от того, что было слышно взрывы, что-то бахкало интенсивно, и я начала, а мама моя спокойно собиралась на работу. И я говорю маме: мам, война началась, куда ты собираешься? Она: я на работу. То есть она настолько не хотела принимать эту информацию.
Мы 2 месяца были в оккупации. Ну, за 2 месяца там ничего, ни продуктов, ничего вообще совершенно никак. Никакой возможности было выехать. Это все полностью под обстрелами.
Скажу чесно, ми перших 3 дні спали одягнені, діти мої теж. Постійно спали одягнені, бо я боялася, що може щось вибухнути, і я приймала дуже швидко. Я, наприклад, знала, що мені там за 2-3 хвилини треба помитися, бо раптом що? Треба буде бігти ховатись. Тому ми жили в постійній такій напрузі.
В этот момент еще бахкало, стреляло очень интенсивно, что-то по небу пролетело. Да, было очень страшно, и поэтому я просто поняла, что надо ехать в другую страну.
Були ми в Житомирській області, і там в Житомирській області ми побули 10 днів, але там були вибухи скрізь. Було дуже страшно, і я схватила дітей навіть без речей, і ми сіли на автобус, перший, який побачили в Житомирі.
Ні, я не зняла кошти з рахунку вдома, бо то були великі черги. Я тільки, знаєте, валізу скоро і то, бо не знала, яка ситуація буде далі.
І так теж особа з 3 дітьми, можна сказати, їхати, щоб на бензину заправити. І все. 70 годин в черзі. Я їхала за рулем 3 ночі і 4 дня. Без сну, без нічого, да.
Вони приїхали без нічого. Я їх не випускали із речами. І зараз вони без нічого.
Все залишила. У мене будинок, машина, чоловік. Всі друзі, у мене все залишилось на Україні.
Ми вдячні Корусу за те, що він допомагає нам і допомагає в першу чергу нашим громадянам, які постраждали від наслідків війни. Завдяки Корусу ми маємо можливість сьогодні приймати наших громадян, надавати їм належні умови проживання.
У нас є і кардіолог, і невропатолог, і фізіотерапевт, і дитячий невролог, і кардіолог, ортопед-травматолог. У нас є повний спектр лікарів, які ми надаємо допомогу 24 місяці.
І ми так знали, що такий є дійсно у вас центр, який може хоч на деякий час нам допомогти. Дуже там добре за нас піклуються, нам допомагаємо.
Саме головне – те спокій, який ми тут отримуємо. От тут ми відійшли психологічно в цих умовах і в цьому навколо природі цій. Ти виходиш і якось взагалі себе почуваєш так, як повинен відчувати людина.
Хочется немножко им сказать: все, можешь не бежать, здесь можно отдохнуть, здесь можно перевести дыхание и набраться сил. Это большая помощь.
І я просто вдячна Богу, що я сюди попала і тут можу безкоштовно харчуватися і проживати.
You're part of something bigger. You don't see it, but I see those smiles. I see those people that are telling me it's help that we are longing for. So it's a lot. You are saving lives, and I would say it's where you are really helping.
If I may just add, John, I hope this video shared a glimpse of what is the reality of the programming, how people are getting the assistance with gracious and generous support of our donors, all of you that are part of this webinar. And just to finalize this presentation, huge thank you one more time. We're super helpful. It's super helpful. We're very thankful. We're grateful that you are enabling Lutheran World Relief to deliver its expertise, which we know how to do best. And this is both deploying our staff and technical knowledge, as well as extending your caring hand to those that are in huge need right now. So thank you very much. I'm absolutely grateful that I'm part of this webinar today, and thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Tamara. In closing here, your caring support has made the difference in so many lives during this crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. Thank you for sharing God's love with our neighbors who are suffering and in need. While our neighbors' plights in Ukraine are in the news, there are millions of people who are forgotten as they deal with the impacts of the war. In Mali, for example, fertilizer has increased by 220%. Farmers attempting to grow their crops in a harsh environment now face an additional difficulty of growing their food using less fertilizer, which has already decreased their production. As grain shipments have decreased on top of increased costs and costs of growing food and decreased production, LWR is launching a concerted effort to respond to this crisis, which is pushing millions of more people into food insecurity and in some cases on the brink of starvation. People in the countries of particular concern are Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, and Lebanon. As you've already done for the people of Ukraine, we ask that you consider making an additional gift to respond to the needs of people in these countries. You can go to lwr.org and click the donate button up in the top right of the screen, or send your gift through the mail. And if you have any questions that you'd like more information, please contact your donor advisor, or you can reach out to me at jbuck, J-B-U-U-C-K, at lwr.org. And if you don't have a pen to write that down, or you think, is that too many U's in my last name? Just send it to lwr@lwr.org, lwr@lwr.org, and it'll get to me. Thank you for attending this webinar. On behalf of all of us at Lutheran World Relief, we are honored that you've chosen to carry out God's love on your behalf to our neighbors across the world. We have two quick questions that we'd like for you to answer before you close this webinar. They'll pop up on the screen for you. Thank you for taking the time to answer them, and may you have a peaceful afternoon and evening. Thank you so much. God bless you.